Sunrise New York City is a chapter of the Sunrise Movement, an alliance of young people fighting to make climate justice an urgent priority across America and end the corrupting influence of fossil fuel executives on our politics. We're made up of New Yorkers, a grassroots mobilization of young people who are committed to stopping the climate crisis and creating millions of good-paying jobs in the process. Sunrise New York City is so proud to be hosting this event with our endorsed candidate, Shahana Hanif, a real climate candidate and a community champion. Shahana is ready to shatter glass ceilings in District 39. She'd be the first woman to represent the district and the first Muslim woman and South Asian woman elected to council. As the Director of Organizing and Community Engagement in Councilmember Brad Lander's office, she ran participatory budgeting, advocating for projects like Avenue C Plaza, which created a much-needed green space in Kensington. And as a first-generation Bangladeshi American and a survivor of lupus, Shahana understands the intersectionality of the climate crisis. She fights for a walkable, sustainable city, not just because it's a climate issue, it's an accessibility issue. She is more than prepared to rock City Council with her feminist Green New Deal. Our district needs change, and Shahana is the candidate who will bring it. Sunrise New York City is also delighted to be here with Brad Lander for Comptroller, who we endorsed yesterday. Brad is the progressive choice for Comptroller. His track record as the City Council representative of District 39 is more than impressive. And his previous history as a housing advocate and a community planner is invaluable. Budgeting is key to confronting systematic injustices like climate change, housing affordability, and racial justice, and Brad knows that. As fiduciary of pension funds, he will divest from fossil fuels and lead strategic alliances of shareholders to compel climate action. Brad plans to invest in building climate resilience and to create good jobs while doing so. As the Chief Accountability Officer of New York City, we know that he will audit New York City's clean energy and resiliency targets to build a greener city. In our just transition away from fossil fuels into future climate justice, every role plays a part, and Comptroller is no exception. It is crucial to have candidates and people in office who are backed by movements because they bring those movements into office. And not only do they advocate for those movements, but they are held accountable by the movements. And that is why we are so excited to be hosting this panel discussion on co-governance with our incredible endorsed candidates, Shahana Hanif and Brad Lander. Thank you.
Ooh, let's hear it for Victoria. Victoria, I'm so honored to be with you and with Shahana and with Alex and with Bill and Anthony. Let me just start by saying what an amazing honor it was to be endorsed by Sunrise yesterday. The young people of Sunrise are insisting, are demanding, are organizing for change at the scale that is needed, both to save our planet and to bring a kind of climate justice in coming generations that is necessary, that recognizes not just the environmental issues the planet's facing, but the justice and equality issues that the planet is facing. And then you have injected those issues into people's consciousness in just a remarkable way. And as we start to talk about co-governance, you can't help but think about that moment when Sunrise sat in Nancy Pelosi's office and woke people up to the necessity of a Green New Deal in the ways people hadn't seen it before. And I think everybody is really clear that that's parts inspiration, parts policy, and parts accountability. And that kind of organizing really just inspires and motivates. So I feel thrilled and so grateful and so excited to build together and really excited to do it tonight, excited to be here with Shahana, the Sunrise endorsed candidate for the 39th district and longtime dear friend and organizing co-conspirator of mine. And obviously to talk with Bill and Anthony. I want to talk just briefly about this word co-governance. Which is what we put in the title for tonight's event, co-governance in the climate movement. And, that's kind of like a new and maybe fancy word, but it's really so worth digging in on during Earth Week, because I think sometimes the ways we think about the relationship between movement and electeds is a little thin, a little transactional. So movements on the outside are organized and are coming up with campaigns, are doing power mapping. And a lot of times those power maps rightly have elected officials as the targets, as the ones who will be organized with demands and will be expected to do something, to divest from fossil fuels, to pass an aggressive policy that requires buildings to be retrofit, that stops allowing fossil fuel hookups, on and on and on. And that's critical. At the same time, if it's thought of just as a transaction, kind of works in both directions. Elected officials are thinking about their next election. Am I going to get support? Activists, organizers, folks on the ground, movements are thinking, how are we going to win our next campaign? But if we're going to achieve transformational change, not just individual transactions, then we need a real theory for how to do inside-outside work in a way that's bold and ambitious, still involves real accountability, right? It's not like we're all just one easy team and elected officials, once they're endorsed by Sunrise, get to like put a badge on. It is essential that there still be that relationship of demand and accountability and pushing. I guess I think of it as the kind of having your back, you know, where someone's got your back, but they are pushing you forward. Like that's the form of back having that this kind of co-governance takes. And it inspires us to think of it as a cycle where there's organizing. It's got to start on the ground at the grassroots in frontline communities, organizing with people who are most affected, building those demands, doing the research, building together with elected officials, because actually implementing the policies in a lot of cases takes a lot of work on the inside, and somebody who knows how the tools work, who knows where the folks who make the investment decisions are, who understands that if you're going to actually mandate all those buildings to get retrofit, you need a whole system of checking, but then thinks of all of that as a kind of circle that empowers activists to keep demanding more, keep building more movement. That's true in general in progressive work, but boy, it is even more true at a moment like this, if climate justice is really our goal. So I'm excited to explore how we build that together, and what better folks could we have on the outside, folks who are doing the movement building work, than Anthony Rogers-Wright and Bill McKibben. They have each in different ways in different spaces shown how to build a climate justice movement over a lot of years. So we feel just so thrilled to have both of you here. Bill and Anthony, thank you for joining us as we explore. And I guess what I want to ask you guys to start us off with is to tell a little bit about how the climate justice movement so far has pursued that kind of inside-outside strategy. What have you learned about building power on the ground, relating to elected officials, holding us accountable, and making the cycle keep working to push more and more ambitiously?
Anthony, you can go first there if you want.
Sure, brother. What I was going to say is that I've been in the trenches with Brother Bill on the inside, wearing suits and ties and shoes, and also with this brother on the outside, wearing t-shirts and sneakers, taking the streets, bearing witness at Standing Rock, and sometimes even locking down to fossil fuel infrastructure. I think that there is this understanding. Brother Bill and I were both surrogates for Senator Sanders in 2016, where we got to work with the great Dr. Cornel West, who reminded us that you've got to have an inside and outside strategy. Brother Bill, like me, is a student of Dr. King. Bill, even more so than me, I would say, in understanding that the way you get that power inside is through the mobilization and principled struggle on the outside. So whether it's what Dr. King and SCLC did along with SNCC in Birmingham with Plan C, C standing for confrontation, which gave him and other incredible Black leaders, women leaders, the power to meet with people like Lyndon B. Johnson that eventually ratified the Civil and Voting Rights Acts. So I would say that we need each other. It's a synergy. I think Sister Victoria, in her incredible introduction, when she used the word intersectionality, it's putting that into action. And when you're talking about a climate justice movement, which we know, especially with COVID being this great elucidator of all the systems that were not working or working in the wrong way, racial justice, health justice, economic justice, and climate justice, magnifying how all of these things weren't working. And then we see another good brother of Bill and mine, AG, Attorney General Keith Ellison, leading an incredible prosecution team that led to the conviction of Derek Chauvin. But that was definitely informed by principled struggle in the street of all walks of life, races, genders, gender identities, coming together and forcing forcing the hand of the government to, in this case, do the right thing. So I can't say enough that, sometimes it does feel good to put the suit on and to look dapper and to meet with our friends and sometimes our adversaries in Congress, but that power is informed by what the incredible work young people intergenerationally have been doing on the outside in the streets.
Yeah, Anthony, first of all, so good to see you, and even at a distance. And I get my second shot next week, so it won't be long before we're all back out on the streets. Second thing I want to say is what a privilege to be here, and especially a privilege to get to hear Victoria, who I've never heard before. Brad, Shahana, keep an eye over your shoulder. I'd say you've got one election cycle before Windsor Terrace is bringing it. So, do what you can while you got some time. I want to just say a couple of things. I think what Anthony says is so right, and I've never heard this term co-governance before, but I like it. It makes so much sense to me. When Barack Obama was elected president, and we all cheered. I was one of the first people to sign up for Environmentalists for Obama in 2008. But I also organized the first big demonstrations outside the White House during the Obama administration about the Keystone Pipeline because we needed him to stop it. But here's what we did. We told people when they came to get arrested, and it turned into the biggest civil disobedience action about anything in America in many, many years. We said, where are your Obama campaign buttons? Because we're here to show him that we want to open up the space for him to do the thing we think he really wants to do. Because, it's true what Brad said about movements are good at giving a push in the back, and that's important. And it's also really important for movements to understand that part of their job is to get out front and open up enough space for politicians to do what they can, and only they can. That's why Sunrise has been so important. Think of the work that Sunrise has done over the last couple of years, the organizing work that resulted in, lots of people, but Sunrise a big part of making sure that when they started polling voters in the Democratic primaries last year, climate change was the #1 issue. What kind of space? I mean, it's not like anybody thinks that Joe Biden has spent his whole life being a zealot about climate change, but he has space now to operate, and you saw what he did yesterday. He went to work in a way that no American president's ever done. And I want to add that this conversation we're having, look, I'm not in New York anymore. I live in Vermont. It's been a long time since I was a young reporter in New York, but I love the city and I care very much about it. And I'm very grateful to y'all. One of the reasons that I care about it is because New York is the center of the world. And if we're going to deal with the biggest problem the world's ever faced, then we're going to need New York City playing a lead role. That's why it's been so crucial that New York City was divesting from fossil fuel, and that Brad is going to continue that work because that's the center of the world's financial system. And there's lots more that controllers and city councilors and things can do to make sure that Wall Street continues to understand they have to change. New York's also the great world city that there ever was, the most diverse place on the planet. Shahana, I've gotten to spend a lot of time over the years in Bangladesh because Bangladesh is absolutely on the front line of climate change. You can't find a country on the planet that's more at risk. It sits 2 or 3 or 4 meters above the Bay of Bengal. As the ocean rises, farmland now disappears every day. There's people by the hundreds of thousands who've already had to migrate to the slums of Dhaka because they can no longer grow food. It's not like anybody in Bangladesh caused the problem. There's carbon emissions, if you add them up from Bangladesh, are a rounding error in the global tables. But we need all of us around the world in the places that did cause the problem to be working the solution. And that's why when we work with people from all over the world, including from Bangladesh, from low-lying islands in the Pacific, from every corner of the planet, in order to try and open up that space for everybody. And you saw it yesterday at the global level with 40 leaders, some of them a little unwillingly, forced to go on TV and say what they were going to do now to deal with climate change. And you see it in New York, where we've, where all of a sudden, finally, we've turned a corner and people are clearly serious about climate change and taking it on. The same for a dozen other issues. That's just the one where I spend most of my life, and maybe the best example of this global work. So I just got to say, it is a complete honor to get to be with you all today. I wrote yesterday in the Daily News that I thought the Sunrise endorsement was the single most coveted endorsement in environmental endorsement anyway there is in American politics, and you guys are lucky to have it. And I have no doubt you will work to earn it in the years ahead.
Thank you so much. It's truly a coveted endorsement. We worked really, really hard for the Sunrise endorsement. I'm so honored to share that endorsement with Council Member Brad Lander, who is now running for Comptroller, is a political mentor of mine. And what an honor to share space with giants. Anthony and Bill, thank you both so much. And Bill, to your point about Bangladesh, I'll share a little bit more about how my parents, needed to leave Bangladesh for climate safety. And I'm so grateful that we continue to have the conversation about climate justice as a transnational issue, that it can't just be that we're working block by block, but that we're working worldwide and building a democracy that is so massive. So I'm really, really excited. And of course, thank you, Victoria and Alex from Sunrise. Really lucky to have Victoria from Windsor Terrace, which is in the district. And building a climate resilient city means building a multiracial democracy, and we need co-governance to get us there. And I'm so committed to organizing with the political courage and moral clarity that we need more than ever before. And of course, an intersectional vision to implement a Green New Deal, not just in Brooklyn, but across our city. And I'm so excited to do so in deep partnership with, of course, the Sunrise Movement. So I will ask Bill and Anthony another question. Tell us, what are the climate commitments you want to see from candidates running for both local and national offices in 2021? And how do you plan to hold us accountable once we take office?
I think Bill touched on it first with, talking about this being New York City, the financial center of the world. So my first thoughts is like, who are we keeping out of the political process, and who are we bringing into the political process? We cannot have candidates anymore that are emboldened to the fossil fuel industry, which are a big cause of this crisis we find ourselves in. We have an incredible Attorney General, Letitia James, in New York State, who's holding these fossil fuel companies accountable. The organization, of course, that Brother Bill co-founded, along with partners, amazing people like R.L. Miller from Climate Hawks Votes, and of course, Sunrise Movement, did require or ask candidates to sign a no fossil fuel pledge, meaning that you are not going to take money from this industry, so that they do not have more access to you than the people who you are aiming to serve. So then we talk about, who are we bringing into the process? Co-governance. I think that's a huge commitment, and ensuring that we're uplifting the Hermes principles for democratic organizing, which of course were started by the elders and founders of climate and environmental justice, and making sure that the people who you serve have absolute access to you. Sometimes we use the term participatory policy making, democratic processes where the idea of policy is not some Byzantine idea where you have to be, look, I do policy, and many people in my family remind me all the time, I am not the smartest person in the world. My 5-year-old reminds me I'm not the smartest person in the world at this point in my life. And so I think that's one thing that, two things that we are absolutely looking for: a commitment to environmental justice and ensuring that marginalized communities who have been kept out of the proceeds, and in the process of that, Sister Shahana, from your homeland, my homeland in Sierra Leone, didn't take part, as Brother Bill said, in creating this crisis, but are not included in the solutions that can get us out of it. So we also have to have candidates who are committed to, like President Biden has been recently, to centering environmental justice and ensuring that we are getting 40% of investments, and and more than 40% of access to you, because there are so many incredible solutions coming from these communities. Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where the great Elizabeth Yampierre from Uprose, Eddie Batista from New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, Community Solar, in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. We need to scale that out. So we want candidates and lawmakers who are going to go into these communities and not just make empty promises, but learn what's already happening in the areas of just transition and energy democracy and food sovereignty, and so that we can scale them up and scale them out. And then, of course, we, as in the New York perspective, we do want candidates that are going to stand up to governors that try to make budgets that cut out amazing grassroots organizing-led efforts like the Climate Mobilization Act, Local Law 97. We want candidates that are going to commit to seeing the closure of Rikers Island and turning it into a renewable energy hub all the way through in a way that is inclusive and bringing people together. And then I would also say we want lawmakers that have imagination, who are willing to think out of the box. I had a great pleasure of working with Brad on his climate platform. And what I loved about it was this is what the Comptroller can actually do for climate, that imagination and in getting people to think, wow, I had no idea that the Comptroller could do that. So I think that's a sample. I mean, I have a whole other some parameters. We would prefer Yankees fans over Mets fans and Giants fans over Jets fans, but that's a whole other discussion.
Where do the Red Sox fans fit in, though?
Red Sox fans fit in first place right now, I believe. So New York is poised to do remarkable things right now. New York's coming out of the pandemic, and New York's the most important city in the world, in part because everybody always has eyes on it, So here's some of the things that we know have to happen over the next 10 years. If we have any chance of dealing with climate change, we got to make sure that all the big buildings and as many of the small ones as possible are retrofitted to be energy efficient. And when we do that, we're going to save money for everybody who lives in them, works in them, owns them, whatever. But the problem is going to be, of course, coming up with the capital in the first place to allow people to pay the upfront cost of those transitions. Well, you've got the biggest banks in the world sitting right there in the middle of Manhattan. And at the moment, they're funneling money to the fossil fuel industry. And we need them to, people to work hard with them and on them to make sure that instead they're figuring out how to provide the financing that allows people to do the work that needs to be done to make their homes and businesses energy efficient and save themselves money. That's one of the really key things that has to happen to unlock the cuts in emissions that we desperately need. New York City, for as long as there's been automobiles, everybody knows that New York City has devoted more of the city to the car than it should, and that everybody would be a lot better off if the city was a lot easier for pedestrians and bicyclists. And one of the things that'll happen when that happens is that the emissions of carbon will go down too. So I think that all of these things fit easily under the category of whoever's running New York City needs to love New York City, needs to sort of connect with the joy of the place and the kind of vibe of the place at its best. The fact that it's alive, that it's, people are strong and opinionated and so on, and embrace that and figure out how to move that city. The people, the best mayors and councilors and leaders of New York City over the years have been the ones who really did understand it as a place, and understand it as a place that can change and shift to lead the world in new directions. So there's no place I like coming to more. My first trip when I'm done with my shots is I'm desperate to come see the new train hall down there across from Penn State or at Penn Station. I can't wait to see what it looks like and be reminded that, the world links in to the greatest city in the world.
Well, it seems that it is my turn now to ask some questions, and I'm really, really excited about this. Bill's been talking about the diversity of New York, Shahana, and how that informs like the city and what it produces and what it represents. And I'm wondering how your experiences as a disabled Bangladeshi woman of color, has informed your climate activism, and how you plan to bring this idea of co-governance once you get to city council.
Thank you, Anthony. And I really love what Bill just shared about loving the city. That's got to be a mandatory for anybody running for any political office. And so I critique anybody who starts off their stump speech by saying, I hate X about this city. We should be starting off by saying, I love Brooklyn, or I love my neighborhood. And that's why I'm running. I'm running to represent District 39 because Kensington is my home, and it's where my father arrived as a ship jumper over 30 years ago from Bangladesh, settling in the largest working class Bangladeshi enclave in Brooklyn. That's Kensington. And the climate crisis in Bangladesh is what forced my parents to migrate to the United States. And many Bangladeshi families in Kensington are mostly from rural regions, including Shondip, Noakhali, and Chittagong, and have been displaced due to Bangladesh's climate disaster. What's happening in Bangladesh continues to impact and unearth climate challenges, as we know, everywhere, continuing to hurt our most vulnerable communities first and worst. And District 39 is a climate vulnerable district. Hurricane Sandy led to massive flooding in the Gowanus Canal and the surrounding neighborhoods, especially hurting public housing residents and working class neighbors. And the city still has not recovered from Sandy, and private developers continue to receive priority over the creation of resilient neighborhoods. And I'm running for city council because I understand the climate catastrophe frontline communities in our district and in New York City are facing and will face in the coming years. And I also understand the necessity of connecting our struggles globally. And I'm so happy that we started off this conversation by being very intentional about this issue being one that is transnational, and the kind of coalition that we really need to build beyond borders and geographies. I was diagnosed with lupus at 17, and this is a disease that now I have a better understanding of after 13 years of surviving it. And I always talk about lupus as a direct result of environmental changes and degradation. And we really, really, especially in this pandemic climate, ought to talk about climate change gravely impacting the health of our communities and how it unearths health issues in a city that continues to divest from healthcare, closing and consolidating hospitals, disproportionately impacting Black, Brown, and working class neighborhoods. And growing up, I watched childhood friends and neighbors throughout Kensington get diagnosed with, for example, tuberculosis, living in cramped homes, public spaces with high pollution, more cars, less open space access increases the risk of chronic illnesses and inflammation for low-income immigrant and BIPOC communities. And these realities are absolutely what informed my advocacy work, from organizing public housing residents to the creation of open spaces through neighborhood organizing in and outside of Kensington, and centering climate projects through participatory budgeting. We've got to democratize the city's budget in making decisions about our climate priorities, climate project priorities. That is one of the most important ways to co-govern. And during my time in Councilmember Brad Lander's office, I led participatory budgeting, and I was very intentional about centering equity and marginalized voices in the participatory budgeting process and transferring power to young people, to women of color in the district. And I've advocated together for funding towards projects that lead to a more equitable, green, open, accessible built environment, from green roofs in our libraries. We've got some green roofs at the Windsor Terrace, Carroll Gardens Library. We're gonna get a green roof at the Borough Park Library. That's the library I attended growing up. To better infrastructure in Prospect Park and playgrounds across the district. And then beyond my work in the City Council, Victoria mentioned this in her introduction, Avenue C Plaza, that is my baby. Together with neighbors, we advocated for the creation of a plaza space. And it's been a gender justice mission for me. We really have to connect also, climate justice is gender justice, especially for immigrant communities. And what we've gotten to do through Avenue C Plaza is build community power and control over the land in our neighborhood. It's so important to see not just the expansion of open spaces, but for neighbors to dictate what takes place on open spaces. And so we've got to be stewards in shaping what gets built in our neighborhoods, and to be stewards of the parks, plazas, open streets, determining programming. And that is exactly what we've cultivated with Avenue C Plaza in Kensington, supported by countless arts and cultural organizations, and not only for programming, but also to incubate conversations about community safety. It's so necessary, especially in the wake of the death of George Floyd and talking about defunding the NYPD, that we continue to step into open spaces to have these conversations very deliberately. My district has seen an uptick in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic attacks, and Avenue C Plaza and other open spaces are where we go to have conversations about how we keep each other safe. And I want to just keep emphasizing our open spaces, because I feel like when we talk about climate activism, retrofitting buildings is what like takes up so much space, and it's so important. But when I think of retrofitting, I think of, you know, guys with hard hats fitting roofs of buildings, and it's much more. And so I want to really bring in the feminist perspective here and root for a feminist Green New Deal, where we emphasize the need for our communities to have power over the land, public spaces, and community gardens. And the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition is where I've drawn my inspiration from, because they have deliberately centered the leadership of women, Indigenous practices, and impacted communities on the front line. And that model by default honors and centers co-governance. And so we've got to continue doing collaborative work through participatory budgeting. That is a huge priority of mine in the next administration. We've got to restore it because it almost died. And then of course, we've got to make sure that the collaborative work is community driven, that groups like Uprose, the Sunrise Movement, Gowanus Canal Conservancy, Big Reuse, Triage, and of course, I'm so proud to be endorsed by Triage and Sunrise, that we educate community members about democratizing utilities to solar power in our languages. We got to do this work in our languages. And that's going to take organizing. It's going to take training our community members in this work. And that is a green jobs pathway. So there's so much to be done to really build a climate justice movement that is multiracial. And I'm really, really just excited to have some bigger tools in the city council to do that.
Can I ask a question of Brad? Would that be okay? Because that was such a great answer, Shahana. You were just right over it, especially with the reminder that green space is, I mean, sometimes one tries to think of what New York City would be like if people 100 or 200 years ago hadn't bothered to set aside parks. And what it would be like is not good. And that's a commitment to keep going on. Brad, look, you're going to have one of these jobs that, you know, if you don't do anything, no one will pay any attention because whatever, you know, life will go on. We've got, you know, scientists tell us we got 8 years to make huge sweeping change about climate. You'll have, you know, $250 billion worth of pension funds, you have big bank accounts, and how do you make these guys in Lower Manhattan sit up and take notice? Or how do you use that leverage to try and actually get global action on climate?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that question. First, though, I do want to just give a little shout out to Shahana on this co-governance topic. When I first got to know Shahana, she was an organizer at CAV. I think CAV might even have then been called the Coalition Against Anti-Asian Violence, and was organizing public housing tenants in Queens. And, I saw her organizing work on the outside. So after Donald Trump got elected, she and I wound up in a dialogue, and it seemed clear that folks in Kensington would be well represented in our office by somebody who was doing organizing inside. That took some adjusting to think about what organizing on the inside would look like. I don't know that I planned for how much adjusting it would require on my part, because there'd be then a lot more demands in the office for what it would look like for the office to show up. So I do just think, as we're thinking about a lot of different models of co-governance and accountability, there's amazing roles on the outside, there's amazing roles on the inside. It's good for people to be able to switch back and forth, and the pushing can come on the inside. And I have benefited and learned, I'm sure, more from Shahana than she from me. So, but I appreciate your question, Bill. I don't think Sunrise will let me off the hook and just ignore what the New York City Comptroller does. But you're right that a lot of people, it's not an office folks focus on, but it is such an urgent office at this moment. I mean, the Comptroller is responsible for taking the long-term view on the city. So much of our politics is short-term, what's going to happen sort of the next news cycle or the next election cycle. And that means the things that matter most in the long term, but that we need to build urgent action for today, don't get attended to. One metaphor I think of this is the Guardian newspaper started putting the CO2 levels in the daily weather report. How do you think about what's the most important in the long term, but build it into action now? And that's the Comptroller's job, to think about what are our biggest, most catastrophic long-term risks, financial and physical and infrastructure and human and health, but also what create the biggest economic opportunities if we can unleash the values of a transition to clean energy and a Green New Deal. So that's the mission of the job. And obviously, if that's the mission of the job, the climate crisis is job one, and the opportunities to be a partner are significant. So the first role is as fiduciary of those pension funds, $250 billion, $250 billion, like it said like that. And that is the retirement security of teachers and nurses and firefighters and city workers. And you have to guarantee their retirement security, but that means thinking systemically, because if the planet and the city are so wrecked by climate crisis, that is not it's not a secure retirement. And honestly, you're not going to be able to, even financially, to deliver their retirement security if the broad economy is so wrecked by the climate crisis that Wall Street, it exists for like the short-term profits, but in the long term, it is in everybody's best interest that we make the changes we must make in the next few years. And you're right, the next 8 years that the Comptroller and the next city council and the next mayor are going to be in office are the critical ones. So the current Comptroller has got us on a good path of divesting from fossil fuel corporations, $4 billion divestment, about 2% of the pension funds, pushed by activists. Scott rightly has gotten there and gotten a lot of righteous credit for it, but it's activists who pushed it, who demanded, who organized for it. So that's got to be completed by 2023. There's only 3 of the 5 funds that have agreed to divest. The other 2 have to be pushed to get there as well. You use some of that money to invest in clean energy and in a Green New Deal, but most of the portfolio are in banks and utilities and car companies and tech companies and the broad companies in the economy whose decisions in the next few years are also critical. So, those banks, as the Stop the Money pipeline has shown, have to change and stop lending themselves in fossil fuel extraction, in big oil. And General Motors has shown that you can have a big company that understands it's time to make a transition. It is shareholders in every one of those companies that have an opportunity to step up through shareholder resolutions and say, we want a date by which it's time to stop producing cars that burn gas, change how the utilities are organized, shift the entire economy to a clean energy economy. So that's the fiduciary responsibility. The Comptroller is also the city's chief accountability officer. So you guys have both mentioned our great local law 97, the Climate Modernization and Mobilization Act, to make sure we retrofit all our buildings. But there's a lot of buildings over 25,000 square feet in New York City. And if we don't put up a public dashboard and make sure there's real visible accountability, then it's not going to get done. It'll be a good law, but we got to make sure, that we collectively enforce it. And then finally, the Comptroller, as the city's chief fiscal officer, has to use that financial lens, thinking, what will it cost more down the road if we don't get it done now? And that's true on coastal resilience. That's true on clean energy. And I'll give just one last example here of a plan that we're putting out this week. I went ahead and did rooftop solar on my row house in Park Slope, and a few thousand people have. But what I learned through that process is it's a pretty clunky process. You got to figure out how to get 4 different tax breaks and 2 different sources of alternative financing. We're never going to scale it that way. And we don't make sure that folks in public housing and frontline communities get good green jobs when a ton of individual, row house and brownstone and building owners make those decisions. So it's time to put the city more on the hook here. The city can take some of our city capital dollars, some of that American Rescue Plan money, some of that infrastructure money, and build out a city-owned array of rooftop solar. We'll pay a rent to all the building owners. Now we can go to low-income homeowners and affordable housing and public housing and say, we'd like to rent your roof. We're going to pay you a rent so you can make your housing more affordable or bring down the cost of your buildings. The city will pay for the installation. We'll handle the permitting. We'll dealing with the fire department and Con Ed around battery storage. And we've got a plan that we think could do 25,000 rooftop solar installations over the next 8 years, go a long, long way to converting New York City to the clean energy targets that we've set by 2030. So in all those ways, chief fiscal officer, chief accountability officer, and pension fund fiduciary to bring the urgency of the climate movement to this moment, and then get pushed to do more. I'm excited about all of those things, and they won't be enough. And it's work to do them. So I'll hope that folks on the outside, say, all right, we see you figuring out how to get those things done. And it's not enough. It's time to do this next thing. It's time to see it more urgently. If you're really the office attentive to the long-term thriving of the city, this is the moment to step up.
Thanks, Brad. We're going to move to a audience Q&A. Just to introduce myself real quick, my name's Alex. I use they, them pronouns. I'm also from Sunrise NYC with Victoria. We're very excited to be talking to Shahana and Brad, our newest endorsed candidates. So we have a bunch of awesome questions that we got from the audience beforehand. So we're going to try to get through a few of them because we're running a little bit short on time. So we're going to start with Bill. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're feeling about the Biden administration's commitments on climate so far? Where have they come up short, and what else are you hoping to see?
Well, I mean, the problem with climate change is nothing's ever enough. We're very far behind. And the reason we're so far behind is because we wasted 30 years. The fossil fuel industry told a series of well-organized and expensive lies for 30 years that kept us from doing anything. And so now we got to squeeze the work of 40 years into 10 years. And that's really hard. But the thing that's on our side is that, the engineers are doing a great job, and the price of renewable energy just keeps falling and falling and falling. If we could deal with the things that Brad was talking about, the soft costs, all the permitting and the, that kind of stuff, we could be moving really fast. And we've got movements now that push hard. So there's a chance for real radical, quick escalation of the pace. And so what Biden did yesterday was a start, He's got the hard job of figuring out how to, get anything through the United States Congress. He's, it makes New York City, which is no, nimble little bureaucracy, look like a, functional government. Somehow you've got to get 50 votes, if not 60 in the US Senate to get anything done. So I got to say, I think he's doing more than anybody would have expected. And what we have to do is just what AOC and Ed Markey did on Tuesday, which is just keep proposing more and saying, here's the next level to go to. And if nothing else, that makes his job easier because now he's the guy in the middle with the, moderate plan to get things done, but I mean, look, some ways Biden has an easy job. Following a moron is an easy job in that whatever you do, you look reasonably good. We're at the 1-year anniversary today of Donald Trump suggesting that we all inject ourselves with bleach in order to deal with the coronavirus, okay? So yeah, compared to that, Biden obviously is gonna look good. But I think he's, I think everybody's happily surprised. I was talking with Bernie the other day, and I said to him, you changed the politics of our country, and now Biden's kind of collecting collecting the chips from the bet that you made, and that's a good partnership to have. That's that's getting it done. And I want to say one more time something I've said before. We've been talking about Sunrise on a local level, but I just want to say on a national level, the way that they've handled the politics of all of this has been a masterclass in how to do this, in how to push hard for more change and get more done, but then also understand that, that it doesn't do any good to just keep shouting all the time, that you have to also give support and open up space. And it's been brilliant to watch. And I've more or less co-opted my political opinion having to the Sunrise Movement for the last year or so, which is good because I basically want to just concentrate on going after the CEOs of big banks anyway, because those guys drive me nuts.
Thanks, Bill. So to contrast with that sort of national level stuff, question for Shahana is thinking about climate change being such a global issue, as we've talked a lot about today, what can we do on the hyperlocal level, like in city council, to make a difference?
I love that question. There is so much we can do. And I want to first start off by saying that I'm going to be following the lead of youth climate activists. At the largest climate strike in 2019, I listened to one of my role models, 16-year-old, well, she was 16 then, Bangladeshi climate activist in New York, Rebecca Shabnam, articulating the gravity and acceleration of the climate crisis in Bangladesh, and having such a deep feminist analysis of how the climate crisis disproportionately impacts women is important for me. It's important for all of us to know who and which communities climate injustice impacts the most. And so really want to make sure that leaders like Rebecca and other young folks are supported, and that our schools are equipped with curriculum and organizations like Cafeteria Culture, which Rebecca is a part of, to support our school communities. This is where we need to be hosting political education work. Our schools have got to support young people in this work. And I'm so excited to have spent time right before the lockdown disseminating single-use or actually reusable bags to Brooklynites. And so it's an honor to learn from young people. We, of course, have an opportunity to expand public spaces. And with that funding, arts organizations, I will keep talking about Avenue C Plaza. One of my most favorite programs was inviting environmental justice activist Monica Jahan Bose to do workshops with Bangladeshi immigrant women using the sari and like the fabrics that are indigenous to us to paint on them to talk about our climate justice priorities. So to have this work in our languages, in our neighboring open spaces is so important because these neighbors continue to be excluded from shaping environmental policies. And so it's so necessary that we are a part of determining the creation and activation of green spaces in our neighborhoods and calling for the inclusion of all impacted people as leaders as leaders in creating solutions for the city. Of course, a big priority for me also is to oppose race-blind rezonings that ignore environmental hazards. That is a big priority for me, and it's among the biggest powers that the city council has, and to demand environmental impact studies on proposed projects. Taking an environmental justice approach means realizing how action on climate change needs to address housing and transportation, not just green spaces and public infrastructure and clean energy. And when planning affordable housing or preserving existing ones, it's crucial to use an environmental justice lens. It also means making sure that our homes are livable, energy resilient. And I also want to tie in the disability justice aspect of this. I know countless disability justice advocates and folks with disabilities have been advocating for housing that is visible, that is truly empowering or making sure that the visitability guidelines include them, that we can enter the homes that are resilient homes. So it's so important to me that we continue to build housing that is truly livable, but also accessible for the people. One of the most exciting things I'm talking about now is that curbside composting has been restored in New York, and preserving composting facilities like the gem that we have in my district, the Gowanus Salt Lot, is so important to me. And not just preserving existing facilities, but to expand and create new composting sites. And for me, where my focus is the education, making sure that all New Yorkers, including businesses, restaurants, know what composting is. And so to that, I'm really determined to making sure that there's a stewardship program where we are utilizing organizers from our district, from our neighborhoods, who are bilingual, multilingual, and sharing out this information, because it's critical for us to push for a waste management system that is inclusive, and including our communities in those conversations, so that we are not leaving folks behind on this as part of this movement. I also want to uplift, of course, making sure that participatory budgeting survives. That, of course, council members will have priorities on our climate projects and proposals, but I want to really make sure that we continue to expand on participatory processes like participatory budgeting, so that our neighbors and our constituents, and I say neighbors because so many folks aren't part of the voting process. We don't allow undocumented folks to vote, and so participatory budgeting has been a key outlet for young people as young as 11, for undocumented folks to be a part of the legislative process. And so I want to make sure that we not only restore participatory budgeting, but that we expand what participatory democracy can look like in our city, and extending a lens of environmental justice, because that feels key for me in this moment. It feels really key, particularly seeing the pandemic, the necessity of open spaces that we utilize and learn from the innovations we've seen through mutual aid networks on what participatory budgeting can really look like in our city.
Yeah, so as Shahana really highlighted there, intersectionality and racial justice are key parts of climate policy. So for Anthony, you've written before about climate change and white supremacy. How do we upend this relationship, both in our individual lives and in the broader climate and environmental justice movement?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Just a very salient and imperative question. I think what we've seen, throughout last summer and leading up to the conviction of Chauvin, is that we can simply not exist in silos anymore if we are going to efficaciously address and dismantle this climate crisis. We have to understand the root causes of this climate crisis, which are white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonization. What I've been saying a lot is that for people, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in frontline environmental justice communities, communities. They're being choked out by toxic emissions. They're being choked out by toxic policies, and they're being choked out by toxic police officers. And that right there, I think, showcases how we have to address this climate crisis. We know, for instance, that the New Deal, did increase precarity and exclusion of Black, Brown, Indigenous people, women especially, and redlining, which created in many ways these sacrifice zones that we've established. Bill and I have spent so much time in the Gulf South, which is a premier sacrifice zone for the United States of America, if not the entire world. And what we also understand is that when we're seeing sinking land from the United Home and Nation, that is absolutely linked to police brutality of Black and brown bodies. And that is absolutely linked to the placement of harmful pipelines and pollutive industries that literally created areas of the country known as Cancer Alley, where 7 of the 10 highest incidences of census tract incidences of cancer are in an 85-mile stretch in the Gulf South. I had a great opportunity to appear on the with the Years Project with Hop Hopkins from Sierra Club and the great Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. And what Brother Hop said is that you can't have emissions, right, without fossil fuel extraction, and you can't have fossil fuel extraction without dehumanization of certain people who live in those areas, and therefore linking it all to racism and white supremacy. So how do we get over that? One of my fondest memories of my favorite Red Sox fan in the country is Brother Bill coming. I was with an organization that assisted with getting students from historically Black colleges and universities and professors over to COP21 in Paris. And Bill came and spoke to these students and right there establishing this intersectionality, the look on the faces of these students to see this a brother from not one of the most diverse states in the world, we'll just say, coming and explaining the importance and how key people like Dr. Robert Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright are to this fight. And that was huge. So those are like the individual acts as well. Bill having me in his home and just having these really, really deep conversations of how we're going to dismantle this. Another good friend of ours, the great Rev Yearwood, also linking this. So we have to recognize it, first and foremost, that when we look at our city, when we look at our state, when we look at our country, that this has been happening and we can't ignore it. So that's number one. Then, of course, we have to fight the bad and build the new. We have learned from many of the myriad mistakes from FDR's New Deal. Green New Deal, with Ocasio-Cortez and Markey, absolutely center environmental justice. They absolutely say that we have to repair what we have done in the form of indigenous genocide and land grabs, as well as what we've done to people who were the victims of chattel slavery, as a part of getting to actual and realized climate justice for all. So I would also say, which is one of the reasons we're so proud of New York State, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, heralded as one of the most aggressive pieces of climate policy in the country, if not the world, stipulates that 35 to 40% of benefits and investments must go to the communities who are being hit first and worst by the climate crisis, by racial injustice, by COVID-19, right? It's no secret that, or surprise, I should say, that the people who are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 are also the same folk who are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. I'm sure Bill will agree with me, one of our favorite authors is James Baldwin. And I think what Brother Baldwin always tried to do was create this idea of shared fate. There's nowhere to run with the climate crisis. Doesn't care about, Bill said this many times, physics doesn't care about borders, red states, blue states, whatever state. So we have to have this idea of shared fate. And what Baldwin said is the truth that sets Black folk free will also set white folk free. And we have to understand that what that really means. So it's individual acts when we see Muslim people standing up against anti-Semitism when Hasidic people are being attacked in a train, or white people in Portland, Oregon, giving their lives to protect Muslim women because, like, they're just saying this is absolutely incorrect. And then, of course, the hordes of people who took to the streets when we saw a lynching in front of us in Minneapolis and said, no, this can't happen anymore. It's just unacceptable. It is immoral. It is not human, and it's tearing us apart. If there is a silver lining of climate change, it's that we will have to come together and overcome white supremacy, or we will burn, separately. So, whole bunch of individual acts that we can do. We can call it out when we see it, just like when we see sexism and misogyny, and put a stop to it immediately so that it cannot proliferate. We can tie, like the great Tara Houska, who's fighting the Line 3 pipeline right now, writing an article with Ilhan Omar saying this Line 3 pipeline eventually connects to Black people in the Gulf South, and therefore Black and Indigenous liberation are absolutely tied together. And then tying that to poor white folk in Appalachia. Those are also environmental justice communities, y'all. Poor white people in Appalachia have absolutely been extracted from. So learning from the lessons of the great Fred Hampton of building a real rainbow coalition of poor white folk, Indigenous folk, Asian folk, Black folk, and our white allies, we just know is absolutely necessary. And this is why I'm so proud of Sunrise, so proud of the 350s.org, Friends of the Earth, who are really centering racial justice as an element, a major key element and component to the overall climate fight.
Thanks, Anthony. We're going to move into our last question. Hopefully, Brad and Shahana, you can sort of address this with your closing remarks. But so in addition to electing leaders who are serious about combating climate change, what can us sort of regular non-elected people do?
Shahana, you want to start? Should I start?
I think you should start.
So Anthony really started the answer to this question. Let's be clear. And I think what's worth noting here is that somehow the existential crisis of climate change has called into being a movement powerful and diverse and inclusive and multiracial and clear-eyed and insistent enough to confront it. And that doesn't happen on every kind of movement. I think if you look at how much activism there's been, and the fact that instead of functioning as gatekeepers, different organizations, like Bill McKibben in some other movements might have, functioned like a gatekeeper instead of like somebody who could help open the door to so much more climate activism. And you've seen this in just so many different places where there's just room for both, global superstars like Greta Thunberg to emerge, but also people just in their own community starting to roll up their sleeves, whether they're fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline or whether they're third graders in an elementary school saying, what's with all the plastic? I think of the time, Shahana mentioned Rebecca Subnam, and we were both there on that day at the climate strike, and we were kind of like talking, we weren't really listening to the stage, and all of a sudden we just like both perked up. It's like, who is that voice? And that is happening all over, and it's happening with a kind of power like Sunrise is incredible, and Victoria and Alex, it's amazing to be here with you, but it's also dynamite that Triage emerged as a New York City grassroots, even like young people taking leadership too, and that it's working to kind of keep building, and that instead of getting threatened and saying, this is my little turf of, nonprofit advocacy, people are recognizing that the stakes are so clear that we need to just bring more and more and more people and keep pushing each other. And I'll just, observe that I think this point that everybody's made, but that Anthony just made, about the urgency of seeing the connections of racial and economic justice and climate justice. I think, what I think right-wingers thought when the Green New Deal popped up and said climate activism must include that racial justice lens was like a lot of people would sort of step back from it. Some people in the climate movement would say, well, that's not us, we don't. And the opposite has happened. More people have come to see that climate activism requires understanding that Black Lives Matter, that frontline communities must be at the center, and that sort of activism is the renewable resource that we're going to use to fight it. So there are so many great places to plug in and get involved. Just on this call, obviously, Sunrise is an amazing one. We've got some Triage activists, but that's happening at every level, from the Stop the Money Pipeline campaign that Bill mentioned to a whole bunch of the ones that Anthony did. And it's, that is the work of our lifetimes, and we all have roles to play.
I'll just add on that we really have to center participatory initiatives. And I'll say this one more time, participatory budgeting is important for our climate movement in the city, alongside, of course, getting plugged into all the organizations. I know that many of our neighbors may not have the time capacity to be members of groups and organizations. And what I find so beautiful about participatory budgeting is that I don't find this beautiful, but I love that one of the most popular ideas that has come up every single cycle, and in our district we've been doing it for 10 cycles, is the need for litter baskets. So we see every day as we're walking in our block, in our neighborhoods, we are seeing what's missing. And so we have a responsibility as neighbors to be more observant, to be more alert, to see where our public spaces don't have benches, where our public spaces have unhoused folks who need immediate supplies, how we as neighbors can show up better, where those spaces can also have positive programming, where we can bring in an arts organization. So everybody's gotta know that they're a part of this fight. And so PB has been one outlet where I've seen folks who have felt isolated or left out of the political discourse feel like their issue on their block absolutely matters. And of course, over the years, we've gotten more trash receptacles funded, but also want to just point out that those same folks have been the ones to advocate for a restoration of curbside composting, for example, or to demand that we don't divest from the sanitation department, that we invest in the sanitation services that our city needs. So as an outlet, I feel participatory budgeting is absolutely important as we get plugged into not just demanding better services around waste management, but for our libraries, from outfitting libraries with solar roofs. Those have all come from neighbors who were not environmental justice activists. The same thing with demanding better transit infrastructure. We're about to get an elevator at the 7th Avenue FG station in the hospital corridor of my district. And that power came from neighbors. That power came from, of course, advocacy of disability justice advocates and neighbors, and demanding this be a priority for our transit fight. And so PB is critical, and any other participatory initiatives that really democratize how neighbors in the city decide where the money goes is important for me, and I will continue to commit to that.
I'll just say real quick, 10 steps. Okay. Step 1, get good candidates elected. I just donated $50 to Brad and $50 to Shahana. So that's how I got involved. Steps 2 through 10, hold elected officials accountable. That's pretty much my process right there.
2 through 9, hold them accountable, and 10, recruit other climate activists to run for office.
Go. I love the amendment. Right on.
Guys, I hate to bring this party to an end for me, but I unfortunately have got to. Earth Week is a busy week. And I just want to say extraordinary thanks to everybody here today, to my old friend Anthony, to Shahana and Brad, who are going to do remarkable things, and to the people from Sunrise, Alex, Victoria, who've already done remarkable things and are going to do a lot more of them. We actually don't know if we're going to win this climate fight. It's an open question because it's a time test, but we know we're going to give it one hell of a fight, that the battle is engaged, and it's awfully good to have lots and lots of people to be shoulder to shoulder with. So thank you all enormously.
Thank you all so much. I really loved Anthony's remarks on how to get involved in the climate fight. We've got to elect leadership. We've got to elect leadership who take this fight seriously and will fight together. because we've all got to be a part of this movement. And so I'm really excited that I'm running for city council, and I want you all to be a part of the movement that we're building right here in Brooklyn. We have an upcoming bike event. I know we didn't get to talk a lot about bike infrastructure, but having bike support and protected bike lanes is important for me. And so we're doing a bike tour, an accessible bike tour, because I'm somebody, because of lupus, have had to get both of my hips replaced. And so really want to talk about this conversation from a disability justice lens. And so please save the date, May 2nd, 11 to 1 is when we'll do this bike ride, followed by canvas. And of course, folks on my team have shared links to our climate plan, our Feminist Green New Deal, and the link to volunteer. I really, really hope to see you all on the campaign trail with me. We are only 9 weeks away.
Brad, any parting words for folks?
Oh, this was incredible. I guess I just want to kind of end where we began by thanking Sunrise for bringing us together and providing this platform. This has been a really rich and beautiful conversation. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Shahana. But you know, the movement, the pushing, the organizing, like that is what is most critical. So Victoria and Alex, everybody from Sunrise, thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's you know, this, I guess that's Friday is kind of like the end of Earth Week, but all that means is we got even more work to do next week. So onward.